Welcome to Meadowlarkers 55, Buyer's Remorse, with a question mark. I am Howard Bryant. Amin Al-Hassan is here. Kate Fagan is not, pressing business elsewhere. In her stead, we've got the great Dave Zirin, Edge of Sports pod, author of many, many books, including The Kaepernick Effect, and we've got film, Behind the Shield. Check that out. Dave made his maiden voyage on Bob Costas, back on the record last week on HBO. Welcome, Dave.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
We got Meadowlarkers 55, which means it's honorary captain's time. I know, Amin, last week you threw in white chocolate Jason Williams as the 55 who shall lead us. I threw in Tim Lincecum, gave the New Yorkers a little love with the great linebacker Gary Reasons. Also threw in San Francisco. I said Tim Lincecum already.
Yep.
I gotta go. Even if you want to throw some pucks in there, you can throw in Larry Murphy, the defenseman for the Pittsburgh Penguins. But for me, I gotta still represent the Boston's New England Patriots. Willie McGinnis gets my 55 this time around. I see head shaking, but so what?
Mutombo would like a win.
How could I forget about Mutombo? Exactly. Dave?
Kenny motherfucking Powers was 55. Eastbound and down, Danny McBride. In this house, there's
Danny
only one number
McBride.
55.
East side and down.
I love that show.
Right?
Kenny motherfucking Powers.
Good, really good topic today. We've been talking and listening to players over the last decade, and especially over the last week. First, and we asked the question, how many times we've heard players say, I'm just using my platform. And now we've seen the different various ways where they've used their platform. Once it felt very heroic, whether you're talking about the death of Trayvon Martin in the Miami Heat, obviously those iconic moments, Ferguson, Kaepernick, I Can't Breathe, all of those things, the Maya Moore, the Atlanta Dream. But then we've also had Aaron Rodgers on vaccines. We've also had a lot of other players on vaccines. We've had Kyrie Irving and the Flat Earth Society vaccines, and now the Black Israelites. So we've had so many different ways. And then we've also had silence. And we just came through these midterms, and the players were kind of nowhere to be seen on a pretty important midterm. And it struck me, it just made me think that these are not moments in time. If you're going to be part of it, it's a constant. And while I was thinking to myself whether or not it was fair or not to say, okay, well, do they have to be in on every single moment? It kind of is what being a citizen is about, right? Renee Montgomery and I talked about this on this campaign, the Warnock-Walker campaign. And I was like, well, you guys were so prominent last go round with Kelly Loeffler and Warnock, and not this time. And she was like, well, you have to have something to say. You can't be everywhere every time. That really wasn't exactly what it was all about. And so I'm just sort of thinking about where we are, and obviously starting off again, Amin, with Kyrie. One of the questions that I had moving into this as things continued with the negotiations and the conditions and all of these things, I said to myself, it's not going to be long before he begins to be positioned into that of a martyr. And we're starting to see, obviously, Dave, your man, Atan Thomas, has been beating this drum. Now we see Jaylen Brown beating this drum a bit. And what were your thoughts? What are your thoughts, as we move into this next stage on the Kyrie story?
Well, first of all, I can't remember if I mentioned this on Meadowlarkers before, but 20 years ago, roughly 20 years ago, there was an incident that is not unlike what is happening with Kyrie Irving, in that Charlie Ward in a New York Times Magazine feature was quoted saying things that were pretty much anti-Semitic, calling Jews stubborn, blaming them for killing Jesus, kind of the usual type of anti-Semitism you find in, the Bible Belt kind of churches. And at the time, Commissioner Stern was in charge, and everyone knows he's probably the harshest disciplinarian of all the commissioners in the modern era. And Stern didn't penalize him. And when asked why, he said Ward would have been better off not to have uttered his uninformed and ill-founded statements, but I do not wish to enhance his sense of martyrdom by penalizing him for giving them public voice. And so David Stern understood, as inflammatory and ridiculous as Charlie Ward's comments were, to come down from the top rope with the people's elbow would have only made the situation worse in terms of proliferating that message out there, in the sense that it would have made Charlie Ward into the symbol that he really wasn't. I say all that to say, because that's exactly what Joe Tsai is doing. He's coming out the top rope with the people's elbow. And what's happening now is beyond the conversation of anti-Semitism and of what it means to promote in the social media era, that if you could just share a link, that in essence is promotion. It's moved beyond that and into a conversation that I believe Joe Tsai feels pretty strongly about. And that is, my team, my rules, I'm in control. Because for the last 3 years in Brooklyn, they've had the run of the roost, pretty much, Kyrie and Kevin Durant. And there's no shortage of people who have been saying and pointing out, hey, you guys let them do whatever they want. You got Kyrie coming out and saying, oh yeah, we're all going to coach the team. You got or run the team. Myself, it's a partnership team, myself and Joe and Kevin. And all of these things are counter to the power dynamic that an owner typically enjoys with his team. And I think Joe Tsai now is more than fighting against anti-Semitism. What he's doing is he's fighting against the players having the power in his organization. And that's what this has become.
So suddenly, Dave, we are back to where we always are, which is labor.
There's so much to. First of all, I gotta say, just to clear the air, the people's elbow is not a top rope move. I mean, it was from so you're thinking Macho Man, I think, and that's my great contribution to your show. Second, as we talk about this issue, I think it's so important, and I have not been doing this in other interviews about this topic, because basically what we're talking about is how to understand anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish bigotry from the Black community. That's how it's been framed in newspapers. I've been framing that in some articles. And I've really been sitting with how problematic that is, particularly after in my area in Bethesda, which is, whiter than the time that Wonder met bread. That's Bethesda. A bunch of anti-Jewish graffiti went up. And it's a reminder that anti-Semitism is an American issue, not a Black American issue. And right. Black people are socialized in a larger context that is America. And when we separate Black Americans as if they are subject to certain pathologies that the rest of the country is not subject to, I think we do the topic a disservice, especially when the drum I've been beating is that what's problem is less the Black Israelite politics that Kyrie put forward, or that the film put forward that he posted, but the bigger problem is the cheering section about who is loving what Kyrie is saying, about who is throwing demonstrations for Kanye with the Nazi salute up. I mean, when you talk about actionable violence, like things that I actually fear, I'm thinking about Nazis, fascists, I'm thinking about white people. And so
you're not thinking Kyrie and the Black Israelites are coming to get you?
No, I am not. I am not, because I've had many a discussion with Black Israelites at metro stations over the years, because I'm just that guy who wants to talk.
Hey, brother, you got a minute? Come on over here. Your train. You ain't gonna miss your train. Come on over.
No. I'm the guy who they're like, yeah, I can't talk to you anymore. I have other people I want to talk to.
Exactly.
And I'm like, no, come on.
No, you're holding up
the line.
But the other thing,
I'm holding up the line.
That's right. But the other thing that has been stifled in this, while we're talking about the Kyrie piece of it, and we talked about this a little bit last week offline, is the actual legitimate relationship between blacks and Jews, especially up in the Northeast. And Bomani and I talked about this, which this is a regional thing that you don't always get in other places in the country. It really is, a northern, Amtrak Northeast region, DC, Philly, New York, Boston type of thing. And so much of it comes from the two sides of the grievance. There's the Holocaust grievance. There's the slavery grievance. Then, of course, there's the group of Jews that no one talks about anymore, which is part of the root of this, which is the Paul Robeson Jews, the Jews who were backing Jackie Robinson, that group of Eastern European workers who were in support of black liberation, who supported integration. And the Lester Rodney Jews who were out there, out front in the 1930s and 1940s, really pushing for integration. And all of that is in conflict with a more modern relationship, which is financial. And then you start getting into all of the tropes. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's like it's like the number of people who, the minute it seems like someone is applauding or celebrating, then very quickly it turns into racial slurs, right? Like the minute you start talking about basketball being a black game, it's not very long before all of a sudden that becomes the negative. It's the same thing when people talk about Hollywood. Yeah, there are a lot of Jews in Hollywood. Jews built Hollywood, right? They built that industry. If you know anything about the history of that industry, they built that industry. And then suddenly that becomes the negative, and that's where the slurs come into, and that's where all of these things need to, that's where the conflicts come in. And on the one hand, we all know what it's about. People have historical grievances. But to your point, Dave, where the black people suddenly start getting the disproportionate share of the attack is power.
Yes, as is power when Jews get a disproportionate amount of the defense.
Yeah.
And which is something I've heard from a lot of people and been very sensitive to, is this idea that, people are insulted and degraded in our society all the time. And when it is Jewish people, there's a bit of a freak out. Like I had a family member who I don't want to say who, but an older family member who watched Chappelle's monologue.
I was just about to go there, but thank you for leading us in to Chappelle's monologue.
He got in touch with me and he was enraged. Anti-Semitism under the guise of comedy, whipping up hatred, no different than Kanye and Kyrie. And I was thinking to myself, this relative of mine has never walked into a family gathering without a Polish joke at the corner of his mouth. And it's that kind of reflection, honestly, in our era of grievance, frankly, just isn't happening like it should. The reflection that also says the way we actually fight anti-Semitism is a broader movement against all forms of oppression. And when you have someone like the Israeli ambassador to the UN thank Joseph Tsai for, quote unquote, putting Kyrie in his place, he's not doing the fight against bigotry and oppression any favors. And I think we need to differentiate this idea of people who take the grievance and use it for more prejudice and people having genuine concerns and trying to build movements to put hatred at bay.
And Amin, there's another piece of this too, not to put you on the spot, but I'm throwing it your way. And that is that, yeah, we're talking about two different things. The minute I saw the Kyrie stuff, I said, I would love to have Kyrie have a conversation with the Robeson Jews. The guys who in the United States who were actually fighting, racism. I mean, good conversation. This isn't a Jewish issue in some ways. But you also have to think of is, let's go back to when Kyrie was with the Cleveland Cavaliers. And you had David Blatt throwing Bibi Netanyahu in every sentence during the NBA Finals. And that is a different story. That is Israeli politics and U.S. foreign policy. They're not the same thing.
Right. And that's go ahead.
And and also throw our good friend Dwight Howard out there, who said free Palestine for exactly 32 minutes before he was running at full speed away from from a very simple, basic comment. I mean, the thing to remember here in a lot of ways is this: you're dealing with American foreign policy too. If you run for president in the United States, the very first question people ask you, they will ask you, is what is your position? You know, are you committed to the security of the state of Israel? That's it. Right. I mean, you can criticize white people in the United States before you can criticize that. I mean, as a condition to run for president, I mean, you've got a real, you know, you're dealing with a foreign policy, and that is on top of every other question here that we're dealing with.
I mean, so David, do you want me to talk about Israel?
No, you wanted to, you wanted to jump in. So let me, by all means.
I just might have a little more space to do it on the cultural firmament. I'll be very brief, and then we should talk about this question about, like, is Kyrie in fact a martyr? Joseph Tsai, those were fascinating points, Howard. But just to say, a combination of Holocaust guilt, as in the Western Europe and the United States effectively let it happen and knew it was going to happen, and then we're faced with the horrors in the aftermath. A combination of that, and practically simultaneously the formation of the State of Israel in 1948 with the help of course, heavily of Western Europe at that time, created a situation where Jews went from being non-Christian actors in the United States to effectively being, I would describe it as, conditionally white. Mm-hmm. And tons of the privileges that come with being white, yet still not exactly like the Italians and the Irish and people who went from being looked down upon in this society to getting a leg up. And that position of conditional whiteness, first of all, it does separate communities that used to be in not just in dialogue, but linking arms with one another.
Yep.
Yeah, and that's on the people with the privilege, I would argue, in a big way. So that's the first thing about the conditional whiteness. The second thing is, in the Trump era, particularly as he's tried and successfully, I would argue, driven this wedge between Israeli Jews and Jews in the United States, mm-hmm. and turning Israel effectively into a GOP platform plank, while more Jews in the U.S., especially young Jews, drifting away from Zionism, drifting away from lockstep support for Israel. And you couple that with the hate attacks, the shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue, I mentioned in Bethesda, it puts the condition. And Charlottesville, of course, Jews will not replace us. It puts for a lot of people I'm talking to in the Jewish community, the conditional part of conditional whiteness is showing up like it never has in their lifetimes.
Well, and that is also, sorry, Jay, go ahead.
No, just to say that makes them scattered, both looking for allies and causing some side eyes of people who said, where have you been? It's like, we're with you on being against the Nazis, the fascists, the racists, but we've been fighting that fight for decades, kind of while a lot of you have been chilling.
Yeah.
And so that's not to say there haven't been heroic Jews throughout the decades who've done this work, particularly in the Black freedom struggle, but there is this other side to it that we have to acknowledge as we have these discussions.
Well, exactly. And then the other piece of it is, too, like, the reason why Kyrie is being turned into that martyr space isn't just Joe Tsai, and that's a big piece of it, and then we can get into that in a minute, but also to that idea of conditional whiteness, the number of people who have said, well, the thing, you know, it's how the Irish became white, obviously, as we were talking about before, and then, you know, that the phrase was put to me, well, they can check in and check out whenever they want. They can be, they get to be minorities when they want. Then they also get to dominate when they want. And that creates, when you're in a situation like this, even if you don't even listen to what Kyrie's saying, then you see the response. It's always the response in terms of the proportionality of it, the tone of it, put you in your place. Mm-hmm. And I don't really agree with Atan at all on this. But the one thing that you look at it and you can feel it, it is, once it becomes open season on a guy, then the tide shifts. Mm-hmm. You know, go ahead, Amin.
The only thing we should be intolerant of is intolerance, right? That's the It's the grand paradox, right? Like I think that we should be tolerant of everything except intolerance. When it comes to intolerance, we should be intolerant of that. But what ends up happening is you get into what I like to call grief Olympics, right? Like, oh, who's had it bad versus who's had it worse, and who's having it worse now, and all those things are all diversions to the central theme, which is intolerance of any sort. When you talk about Kyrie and the backlash, right? It is what you are hearing is the voices of millions of people say, all right, his intolerance was wrong, but now there's a different kind of intolerance that's happening here. And it's not based on his opinions. It's based on the trope of the uppity Negro who needs to be put in his place.
In the 80% black league.
Right. Exactly. In a league in general, and an organization specifically, that the prevailing conventional wisdom is the players run it, right? This is the league where the labor are calling the shots, and there are a lot of people in this country that think that is not good.
Regardless, and they think it's actually true.
Well, yes,
not completely true.
Right. So
about run the NBA.
One of my favorite things, I've been, I guess, alive. I don't know if that's the word to call it. I've been alive for 3 lockouts, 95, 99, 2011, right? And in each one, you get what the players had got shrunk a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. We had work stoppages in 98 and 2011. And it's amazing how many people will call it a strike.
Well, people don't.
And complain about how the players, you're so greedy.
Well, we had this conversation during baseball earlier this year.
Right. The idea that the players are greedy, that America is such a weird place because it is a place where people identify with the elite crust that they will never join.
Yep.
Like, of course, these billionaires should have billions, right?
And that their billions is somehow it all depends on the type of labor that we respect. We don't have professional respect for the genius athlete. But if you wear a suit or if you run eBay or something, then we have all kinds of we anoint to you a genius level that you may not have even earned.
Yeah. Right. But the idea is that for many of the viewing public, the population that watch the sport, they identify, and this is a basketball specific thing, they identify more with the owners.
I don't think that's basketball specific. They identify. I think that's sports. I think that's professional sports specific.
They identify with the owners over the talent.
No, 100%.
And so what's happening to Kyrie, that's why I get like, I don't want, and there's another element to this conversation in a little bit. I want to go down this tangent, but not to excuse or give a pass to what Kyrie did and his stubbornness and not wanting to just say, my bad, didn't know what was in that video and keep it moving. But there is a threshold that crosses over from punitive measures towards what he did versus, and let that be a lesson to the rest of you.
Well, but let that be a lesson to the rest of you, because it's a reminder who runs this shit, right? That money's not for nothing. And when you join the mainstream, no matter where that mainstream is, part of that deal of taking that money is living on that line, like it or not. I mean, and that is part of the message. Part of the message is that when you remember the National Basketball Association, these are the things that you are going to adhere to. And if you aren't going to adhere to them, you can always say nothing. The world doesn't need to know everything you're thinking, but this idea, and this goes back to to where we are in this moment of in time, where we're talking about athlete activism and using your platform and being free to say stuff and all of that. I mean, we saw that with Kaepernick, which is that there are certain things that you're not going to discuss on your terms, or you're going to be broken for them. Now, obviously, when you make $350,000 per game, it's really, really hard to have people feel for you, because these are the conversations that nobody gets to have, right? Nobody gets to have them in the United States for the most part. Even if you're a basketball player, if you're a reporter, whatever, there are certain things you just don't talk about because you can't win those battles.
I mean, I think that's a great point. I want to say, and actually, I think I'm building on a point you were making, Howard. I think what's happening right now with Joseph Tsai and Kyrie is actually politically healthy in the long term. And we may actually even look back on this as politically healthy, as distorted and warped as it all is, because Adam Silver was selling what I think needs to be acknowledged as a fiction to the public. Mm-hmm. And I hate using the word woke at this point, but this idea of woke marketing, I won't, but if you can think of a better word, great. How about enlightened marketing? And I'm not using the W word, but this idea of we are marketing ourselves during a period of social unrest in this country as a place where athletes, particularly Black athletes, the most important Black employees in the United States in terms of their platform and power, we are supporting their ability to speak out and be heard about their experiences and their thoughts. And yet at the same time, you always felt like it was within limits. And I felt that the first time when that question came up, will any NBA player kneel with Colin Kaepernick? And other than, I think
there's always limits.
Yeah, the limits are placed down and the strictures are put down. And so that means that right now, I mean, a lot of true colors are showing, and I think the players are having a visceral reaction to that, because it's not just, as you both have said, it's not just that Joseph Tsai wants to reorder the power structure on the Nets. Joseph Tsai is being a condescending bastard. Mm-hmm. His actions, to me, the 5 points that must be met, meeting with the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, an organization that is deeply problematic on a number of fronts that I could talk to you about, not the least of which is hardcore criticizing of Jews who support politicians like Ilhan Omar or support people in the Black Lives Matter movement. So the ADL has actually made interventions into Black struggle to de-link Jews from that struggle, the very thing that I'm saying we need to have happen. They're saying the opposite, and Kyrie has to go to them on bended knee. And
at the same time, Dave, just to stop you right there a little bit, at the exact same time this is happening, when anybody who tries to express gets shot down hard. The Dwight Howard example, shot down hard. The Deshaun Jackson, okay, he puts his foot in his mouth and suddenly they want to put him on a flight to go, they want to send him on a flight to Israel. I mean, this is the other piece of the backlash.
Yeah, this idea of that people, particularly Black people, need to be educated in a very top-down way. And this is what Jaylen Brown, I think, was clearly referencing. You do a Google search of Joseph Tsai, you see a lot of stuff that, would make a grown man have trouble sleeping at night. And yet, we co-founder of Alibaba, ESPN report on this. They played a role in the Uyghur cultural genocide. But there's no accounting for, as Jaylen Brown said, for what Joseph Tsai needs to learn and how he needs to be educated about his politics and his life. Well, and I let me be clear, it's like I'm not thrilled with how the players have responded to this. I mean, the silence.
And not responded.
The silence initially, as a huge basketball fan and sports journalist, was very hard to take. But with the Tsai response, you start to see that, okay, maybe this is what's actually needed to clear the air and return that vital component to the concept of athlete activism, and that's the question of risk.
Well, I mean, how much of this also, and I've spoken with a bunch of folks on this very Black specific issue of, hey, not getting involved in this because what the mainstream is going to do to your words. They're going to take you and try to use you as the wedge. They're going to take you and have you be the one beaten up on Kyrie. They're going to have you suddenly be the face of this, in terms of being the person who criticizes. And what happens, when you criticizing one of your own along these lines, you are being positioned as the good Negro versus the bad Negro, regardless of what your thoughts and what your politics are. So most of us stay out of that because we don't want to be positioned that way, regardless of how we feel.
So this was the tangent I wanted to go down, because the idea of what happens when people are trying to have intelligent discourse about these very delicate, very complicated intersectional matters, when our conversation, our words get co-opted by the wrong people. Not because I side with those views, but because those people are looking to cherry pick whatever they can to prove their point. It's like 20 years ago or so, Charles Barkley was, I can't remember what he said, but it was something along the lines of Black people need to stop feeling sorry for themselves. That's co-opted by conservatives and extreme right-wing people. Say, see, basically all of our racist tropes about Black people are true, and as our proof, we bring you Charles Barkley. And Charles wasn't buying into any of that. He was just saying that, on top of all the things systemically that hold us back, there's an element of self-determination that probably needs to exist, right? So,
or continue to exist.
So I kind of, in a weird way, experienced that this week. On Monday on the Le Batard Show, was on with Mike Schur, and we were talking about Chappelle's monologue. And, Mike and Dan were kind of on the way of, Dave was punching down. And I said, well, no, he wasn't. I know, Dave, you just said that, or earlier you said that you had a family member who said, oh, he's just dealing on tropes and all that. And I said, no, he wasn't. He was highlighting just how pervasive all of these prejudices are in our society, in American society. When he tells a joke, he says, a group of Black people, it's a gang. A group of Italians, it's a mob. A group of Jewish people, it's a coincidence and we shouldn't talk about it. When people get upset about that last line as, oh, see, he's playing on the tropes, Jews control Hollywood and have power and stuff. Yeah, as are those other two lines, that Italians are all in organized crime and Black people are all criminals. He's not making fun of Jewish people. He's making fun of the racism that exists in our society, the prejudices that exist in our society. So I made this point counter to Mike Schur. And Mike's counter was, yeah, but there aren't gangs of Nazis hunting Italians in the streets. Like there's basically an imminent threat on Jewish people.
A bunch of Nazis hunting down Black people.
And that was my point. I said, Dave, Mike, you don't think that there's an imminent threat against Black people and has been for like 400 years?
And what about Charleston? Just, I mean.
Yeah. But church bombings.
Yeah.
And so the clip posts and it goes viral. And at first it's a lot of people saying, thank you for explaining it, particularly from the Black perspective. And then some weird thing happens. I don't know what track it.
And then Newsmax got
yeah,
like
a bunch of people like just start hijacking it as if to say, see, Amin's right. These Jewish people are overly sensitive. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying any of that. And in many ways, I thought about Dave, his set, what he was talking about, and how some people got it as this really intelligent kind of breakdown of all America's ugly self. And then some people are just like, yeah, Dave, there are a lot of Jews in Hollywood. They do control everything. And they just hijack his words to prove their prejudicial point. So I asked the question, how do we have an intelligent conversation? Dave, as you say, I'm glad this is happening because I think we're going to get somewhere because of this being out in the open. How do we make sure that it goes as authentic to the conversation itself and not being used to be weaponized in other ways?
Yeah, that's a great question. In this era of social media, I don't know how we prevent it. I mean, words taken out of context, a lie travels across the world in seconds, and then it takes hard, intentional work to unwrap that lie and do what you just did right now and speak about it in a more broad format. I think when I say that there's an improvement here, I think the breaking and the understanding and the clarity for NBA players that no, it's not a players' league. You're not athlete activists, whatever that means you're human beings, and you have bosses, and if you have issues, it's going to run afoul of those bosses. And because you make this money and because you play a game for a living, you don't always get a lot of support among the fans, who think somehow that you should just be grateful for having this job, as if it's not a job that requires devotion,
unearned
blood, sweat. Yeah, exactly. As if it's unearned, as if a billionaire who inherits their money from their family and then decides to buy a team is viewed as somehow inviolate, and you don't criticize them. But the players themselves are always subject to that criticism. And that's a trope that goes back to Jack Johnson, for sure, at least. So we're left in this position of being scared about anti-Jewish bigotry, of feeling like we need to respond to that, of being scared about the fascists who are organizing off Kyrie or Kanye's words. And what's the common fear with the common thread for all of this is fear.
Yeah.
And this idea of we're what my friend Kai Wright calls, we're the United States of anxiety. And what I kept thinking when I was listening to Chappelle was, what's so wrong with sitting back and laughing about this? You know, what's so wrong with taking a second at this moment that is so, I felt this relief watching Chappelle, because I've been in these serious discussions for weeks since Kyrie said it. And it's like, is it so terrible that we say Jewish people got so mad at Kanye, they suspended Kyrie? That was funny to me. Joke, yeah. And also, it's kind of true in a way. Like, if Kanye doesn't say what he said, maybe Adam Silver does adopt the David Stern approach, which, as you read it, Howard, I'm thinking like, wow, that's absolutely right. And that's brilliant.
Yeah.
And
100%.
One should be allowed, accept the backlash, but one should be allowed to be an idiot and post things every once in a while without having it be their career, their shoe deal.
Well, that is the other piece of this too, right? Yes. Where you're looking at this, and to me, I have been pretty critical of Chappelle in his last few monologues, because I do believe he's been punching down. And when the brilliance of Chappelle that I've always admired, I believe, that Chappelle has raced past people that I don't think anybody was ever going to race past. I believe, not that I like lists, and I'm not a list person, but Pryor, Carlin, Chappelle, I mean, he's on Mount Rushmore now, right? He's that brilliant. However, I very much disliked his last several monologues, because I did believe he was punching down. I mean, he talks about how much money he has, more than anything else than he used to. He talks about being rich more now than he used to. He talks about being persecuted, because he's rich, more than he used to. And, his trans stuff is garbage, man. I haven't liked it. I just looked at it and I was like, you can't make this piece all about you. But this last monologue, I thought had a lot of brilliance to it. I thought it was really, really good and really sharp. And one of the things that I really liked about it was that his timing, and I don't think this was an accident, comes right before Trump announces he's going to run for president again. I mean, the thing to remember about all of this is that there is a threat out there, and that there are people, if you want to compare Charleston with Pittsburgh and Tree of Life, nope, you got to put them in the same boat, because there is absolute violence out there against these communities. And that's the reason why when I was thinking about what was happening with Kyrie, I was thinking about Robeson, and I was thinking about that group. I was like, I would love to have that group of people be remembered, that not, the pre-state of Israel conversation where you look at the Jews that came to the United States who were every bit in the same category as the black people they were fighting for. There was an actual alliance there. So there was that. The other thing, too, that I thought about with this as well, just like Chappelle and just to Amin's point, then all of a sudden, Bomani and I were talking about this, and then all of a sudden the phone starts ringing, and it's CNN, and it's NewsHour, and it's MSNBC, and I'm like, nope. You are not getting me to talk about this, because I'm not talking about it on your terms. Because what you want to talk about is you want me to get on Kyrie. I don't think I mean, and to not get on Kyrie is to say that, oh, well, you believe there's a lot of truth to this. No, I think Kyrie's out of his mind, to be honest, on a lot of this. But some of these historical points and some of the historical grievances of who gets to check in and who gets to check out, which black person is going to be positioned as the one to browbeat the other black people, which, thoughts are going to be accepted as
But
legitimate thoughts. What's that?
Don't you hate that, Howard? Like the idea that like I can't say
I knew why they
true
were
feelings about
calling.
something. No, I get it, but maybe I feel like very naive in this moment. But it bothers me that I'm not able, well, I'm able, but I'm discouraged to think critically out loud. Not because I might be wrong or I might be offensive, but because I'm going to be chopped and led in a certain direction with my words, and B, those words are then going to be packaged and shipped to millions of racists everywhere.
And that's right.
As like, this is what
I mean, there's a reason why the last chapter of my last book of essays, Full Dissidence, is called Renters. Black people are renters. When you get to moments like this in the United States, they are reminding you that this country belongs to them. And you are in service of them. You are not in service of your opinion. If they call you, when they were calling me to be in service of them, to take Kyrie and to stomp on him, even though I felt like Kyrie was doing a pretty good job of stomping on himself. Right? I didn't really think that they needed me for this. But when that phone rang, and I said to Bo, I was like, is your phone ringing? He's like, yep. I'm like, did you pick it up? He's like, nope. and what that does, to Dave's point, is it creates, how come the black people aren't talking? Maybe they must be in agreement with it. No, the silence is, you're not using me for this.
Yeah, absolutely.
You're on your own here.
And I put that on Silver too, because when you create an atmosphere that says we're the league that the players might as well be on Meet the Press, it does create an expectation that every issue, whether it's the elections, I mean, what if they just didn't want to talk about the elections, get their foot? That's what, Willie Mays said, the right in this country to not have an opinion is as sacred as the right to have one. I'm messing the words up, but you get his point. It's like,
yeah. And when this podcast is over, I'm going to call you and we're going to talk about the Willie Mays doc.
Oh, I haven't seen it. I'd love to.
You haven't? I watched it last night. Another story for another day. We have got. Go ahead, Dave.
I just want to give a shout to something Amin said, because I've been hitting the history books a little bit, and in the '60s, if you were in the Black Freedom Movement or if you were in anything resembling a progressive synagogue, you had to know what you thought about either Jews or the Black movement. And there were a lot of synagogues that organized to go on the freedom rides, for example. And so you had to have a position on this stuff. So it was an active friction and an active conversation in the 60s. It's been decades since we've had to sort of sharpen those muscles and be able to speak about this intelligently. So what Amin said, I have great sympathy for. It's like, we're all trying to figure this out.
Yep.
And figure out what the best way forward is. And nobody has a perfect answer. We know what's wrong. Like, I know Joseph Tsai and how he's pursuing it is wrong. I know doing anything that could create a martyr status out of this film is wrong. But as far as what's right, I mean, that takes dialogue. That takes conversation. And
it also takes.
You can't have that conversation. It is very censorious.
Yeah, and it also takes a recognition that you're not free.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it's the Don Draper line from Mad Men, right? That's what the money's for, to bring you in to believe that you are part of this, but it's on our terms. So therefore, when you're not going to be able to have this sort of conversation, and God, I am so sick of the terms dialogue and conversation and discussion, because it's like, what are we discussing? I mean, because in so much of this, what we're really talking about is, are you in line or are you not in line? And there are just certain times in certain conversations, certain places where it's like, nope, not me. I already know that I really don't want to have this conversation. Let's switch gears for our final 15 on this. Um, I just want to ask, just maybe a wraparound because it'll take that long from everybody. Um, at the end of the Heritage, Dave, you and I talked about this on stage in DC. The last section of that book asks the question: what happens when the players become the power? Right? What happens when these players start to gain and gain and gain, and when they begin to distance themselves from sort of the grassroots movements? What do you take what is taking place, whether it's the Kyrie situation, whether it's the silence on January 6th from the players, whether it's the silence that we saw really from this last midterm? What do you take from that in terms of assessing this new space after a decade of having the players be involved? Are we sort of moving into this new place where they've sort of all gone, instead of full dissidents, they've gone full libertarian, right? They just sort of go their own way because they're so damn rich and they're so separate. Where do you sort of assess the idea? Are we, let me put it this way. Is the term athlete activism suddenly not aging very well?
I'll go first as Amin furiously writes out an outline for a much more intelligent response than what I'm going to give. But you know me, Howard. I'm always looking first at the movements and thinking that that's the horse that draws the carriage. And when I think about this recent decade, it's like my thoughts go first to the incredible movement that sprung up, particularly in South Florida among high schools after the killing of Trayvon Martin. Over 50 high schools walked out before the Miami Heat ever put on those hoodies.
And Parkland to a lesser extent years later.
Yes. Oh, yeah, exactly. And of course, Kaepernick takes his knee after a summer of serious unrest involving the killings of Alton Sterling and Philando Castile, with demonstrations that shook the country to its core. So it's always looking at where the movements are first. And I think we're living in a time where after the protests of the summer of 2020 and so little changed, couple that with the pandemic, a demoralization really set in. And you see this whenever you talk to folks. Like 2022 feels a long ways from 2020, feels a long ways from 2016. History can be quickly like that sometimes. So because we are nowhere as a people in terms of pushing the agendas of only 2 years ago, I don't think we should expect the players to be able to fill that vacuum. And when we do, we become subject to a kind of romanticism about so-called athlete activists that isn't rooted necessarily in history. Because it starts with what we do, not with what they do.
Exactly. And on top of that, real quick, on top of that, it never did start with the players. The players were following the people. The players were following all those folks blocking the airports, and they were following all the marches, and they were following the different movements that regular ass people were doing, and then they got involved too. The number of players who said to me before, during Ferguson, and Carmelo Anthony said it, I'm watching this on TV and I'm seeing my people in the street, and I said, I'm going home. This never started with the players in the first place. They just had the loudest, most prominent voices. I mean, go.
Yeah, it's funny because this in essence is the very nature of freedom and democracy, right? Which is there is no gatekeeping of the guys who are well informed and have great opinions and great causes that they're fighting for, and the guys who are not, right? Like the moment we sit here and say, well, you can, but you can't, you're starting to take away the very freedoms that this country's purportedly supposed to be about. So there's I agree with both of you guys. Absolutely. It starts somewhere else. The players, the athletes who have been activists throughout history were more, I don't even want to call them figureheads. They were more ambassadors than they were leaders of the struggle. Other than obviously moments where it impacted them in their particular field. So for instance, Bill Russell, not being able to go into certain restaurants when the Celtics are barnstorming in the South. That's a very specific thing that, of course, Bill Russell's going to take the lead on that. But the reality is we have to be in a weird way, not okay with the opinion necessarily, but okay that sometimes we're going to get the wrong ambassadors, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes you're going to get a Kyrie Irving who's going to say things that are foolish, and that shouldn't make us kind of say, well, never mind. But at the same time, doesn't mean we have to agree with everything that a player says with passion to millions of people. And the last thing I'll say is that, Dave, earlier you talked about Adam Silver, and I do believe it was an overstep by the league to market itself as the socially conscious league. I think it's one thing to say we support and encourage our players to be active citizens and engage in civic initiatives for their communities. But it's another thing when you're like, hey, us, yeah, remember us? We're the ones that put Black Lives Matter on the court, and we're the ones that did. I think when you start to market yourself as that, then you get into the problem of the Willie Mays quote, which is, I'm not even allowed to be silent anymore because now we branded ourselves. We're the ones that are going to speak out against every injustice of everything that happens everywhere.
Which they never were anyway.
Which they never were.
Mm. And I might get in trouble for saying this. I don't know. But I think that David Stern, somewhere in his head, when he had that response to Charlie Ward, that I'm not going to make him a martyr, I think David Stern, who, even though I disagree with him about a ton of stuff, got tons of respect for his incredible intelligence and foresight, had the sense to think, maybe it's not the best look if somebody is saying Jews control the world for me to step in and say, no, we don't. Now go to this 5-step program and sit in the corner until you know that anti-Semitism is bad. He understood that that's not the best look. And I think Adam Silver really stepped in it.
And remember Dave and Amin, was it in the 80s, was it, that Sports Illustrated piece with Steve Carlton? Where, I don't think the league did anything to him.
Yeah.
I don't think they did, and he's talking about the cabal of the 7 elders who were running everything in the Swiss mountains somewhere, whatever he was saying, right? And so, that would have got you suspended for a year.
This is Ethan Strauss wrote about this a couple of weeks ago, and in it he quotes a Norman Macdonald joke. He said, earlier this week, actor Marlon Brando met with Jewish leaders to apologize for comments he made on Larry King Live, among them that Hollywood is run by Jews. The Jewish leaders accepted the actor's apology and announced that Brando's now free to work again. You
see,
right? So
this does us no favors.
No, it doesn't do anyone any favors. And I think that the martyrdom piece of this, actually, it really does make things worse, because I think that you're bearing out the point by overreacting.
Mm-hmm.
And the proportionality of it doesn't quite. People were.
Well, you're legitimizing.
People were looking at Kyrie like he was nuts anyway for the last several years.
Yeah.
They weren't looking at him like, oh, he's the existential threat that people are going to really adhere to that message, and he's a threat. They're like, what did he say now? Mm-hmm. And so I think that there's always that, but I think that the other piece of it, and going forward, we're going to have this conversation again on a future Meadowlarkers, obviously, because this is an evolving topic of, you wanted the players to speak, the players are now speaking. Do you really want them to speak? And even if you don't, we're in a new space, and the players are going to say what they want to say, whether it's Aaron Rodgers or whether it's Jaylen Brown or whether it's Kyrie Irving or Kevin Durant. Mm-hmm. And then they're not going to talk as well. I think that it's really important to remember that, taking the long view, over the past 10 years, we entered a space that we hadn't been in the previous 40 years, which is the games are now being interrupted by the world. We asked them to be citizens, and now they're citizens. Mm-hmm. And they've got the resources, and they've got the platforms now to have an impact. And it's interesting, and I think it's important for us to talk about it. We are heading out of time. Final thoughts, anybody?
Jon Stewart, people should watch what he said to Stephen Colbert about this. I think that as looking for a Jewish voice to say, what the hell are we doing here? It is something that I'd been waiting for. And the fact that it was Jon Stewart was a good thing, because as you know, he's king of the Jews. I don't know if you guys, that was from the 97 secret international conference. He was elected then. And
I get the newsletter.
yeah. Oh, no, you don't get the newsletter. I get the newsletter. If I could just wish one thing, I would wish for all of us to have a little more patience with one another as we talk about this. Because, Howard, what you said is so right about us not dealing with this in 40 years. If we haven't dealt with this in 40 years, maybe we won't figure it out in 40 seconds.
Yeah, exactly right. It's going to... And also, these players are... the thing that always gets me, Amin, and you can finish up with us here, the thing that always gets me is they're still really young.
Oh, man.
You know, Jaylen Brown's, what, 25 years old?
Yeah.
I mean, so if you had asked me a question about anything between the age up until age 30, probably, I probably would have been suspended every single day. Right.
I think we could end right there.
We could end right there, right? It's like, oh, did you go see Andrew Dice Clay at the TA in Philadelphia? Why, I most certainly did. Did you laugh? I kind of did. I'm going to tell the truth, right? I mean, so there's all, it is that. And I think perspective is really important. This is the end of Meadowlarkers 55. Dave Zirin, thank you. Amin Elhassan, thank you. Kate Fagan, thank you, wherever you are. Next week, for our honorary captains, it's a big, big number, people. 56. Which obviously means it's Tanyan Sturts week.
Oh!
You got an LT.
It's Tanyan. When I think New York 56 athlete, I think Tanyan Sturts, New York Yankees. Obviously, that would be Lawrence Taylor, maybe in a landslide. But maybe Andre Tippett, New England Patriots, 56. And I think that we should think about this, that there are certain numbers that spawn the big numbers, the number 32 running back, the number 56 linebacker, something to consider. And we've got a week to consider it. But right now, obviously, LT is going to be our honorary captain for next week. We will see you next week on Meadowlarkers 56. I'm Howard Bryant, Amin Elhassan, Dave Zirin. Be good, y'all.